A hidden truth. The 1930 family photo that concealed a secret for nearly a century. James Brennan wiped the dust from his hands as he surveyed the cluttered storage room at the back of the Lincoln Community Archive. At 63 years old, retirement had proven far too quiet for his liking. Volunteering to catalog donated materials gave him purpose, a reason to wake up each morning and connect with the stories of people long gone. The cardboard box in front of him had arrived 3 weeks earlier, part of an estate sale from a storage facility in Chicago. Someone's entire history, packed away and forgotten, now reduced to items sold by the pound to clear space. James treated each donation with reverence, knowing that behind every photograph and letter was a human life that deserved to be remembered. He lifted items carefully from the box. A stack of letters tied with faded ribbon, a small wooden box containing military medals, a Bible with a cracked leather cover, and beneath it all, wrapped in brittle tissue paper, a collection of photographs spanning decades. James spread the photographs across his work table, organizing them chronologically by the clothing styles and photographic techniques. There were wedding portraits from the 1920s, children posed stiffly in their Sunday best, families gathered for holidays. Each image told a story, though most of those stories were now lost to time. Then his fingers touched a particular photograph that made him pause. Unlike many of the others, this one had a certain quality, professional composition, careful lighting, and a dignity that transcended the obvious poverty of its subjects. The photograph showed a black family of 5, standing in front of a modest 2-story wooden house. The image was in black and white, slightly faded with edges that had yellowed with age. On the back, written in careful pencil script, were the words, "Johnson Family, Oklahoma, Summer 1930. James studied the image with growing interest. The father stood tall on the left side of the frame, his posture dignified despite the worn work clothes and patched pants. The mother, positioned in the center, wore a simple cotton dress and apron, her hand resting protectively on the shoulder of a young girl. 3 children of varying ages completed the family portrait, all barefoot, all gazing directly at the camera with expressions that spoke of resilience in the face of hardship. The setting itself told a powerful story. This was rural Oklahoma during the Great Depression, during the devastating Dust Bowl era when drought and economic collapse had brought countless families to their knees. The house behind them showed peeling white paint, a small sagging porch, and in the distance, a weathered barn that had seen better days. James had cataloged hundreds of photographs from this era, but something about this one felt different. There was a weight to it, a sense that the image contained more than what was immediately visible. He set it aside in a special folder, intending to give it closer examination later. As the afternoon light began to fade through the storage room's single window, James picked up the photograph again. He couldn't shake the feeling that this family had a story worth discovering, a story that deserved to be told. 3 days passed before James returned to the Johnson family photograph. He'd spent the intervening time cataloging the rest of the donation, organizing letters by date, researching the military medals, and preparing detailed descriptions for the archive's database. But the photograph kept drawing him back, an inexplicable pull that he couldn't ignore. On Thursday morning, James brought the image to the archive's small digitization room. The Lincoln Community Archive had recently acquired a high-resolution scanner purchased with a grant specifically for preserving historical photographs. James had been trained on the equipment just 2 months earlier and was still learning its full capabilities. He placed the Johnson family photograph carefully on the scanner bed, handling it with cotton gloves to prevent any damage from skin oils. The machine hummed to life, its light bar moving slowly across the image, capturing every detail with remarkable precision. When the scan completed, James opened the file on his computer. The digital version appeared on screen, crisp and detailed in ways that were impossible to see with the naked eye. He zoomed in slowly, examining the faces of each family member, studying the texture of their clothing, the grain of the wooden house behind them. Then he noticed something unusual. In the second-floor window behind what appeared to be a white lace curtain, there was a subtle shadow, a shape that didn't match the interior darkness one would expect. James increased the magnification, his heart rate quickening. He adjusted the image contrast, enhanced the shadows, and sharpened the focus. What emerged made him lean back in his chair, blinking in disbelief. Behind the curtain, partially obscured but unmistakably present, was the figure of a small child. But this child was distinctly different from the family members standing proudly in front of the house. The skin tone was pale, the hair appeared light-colored, possibly blonde, and the features, though partially hidden by the translucent curtain fabric, were clearly Caucasian. A white child hidden in the window of a black family's home in Oklahoma in 1930. James's mind raced through the historical implications. This was the era of rigid Jim Crow segregation, a time when racial boundaries were enforced with brutal violence. In Oklahoma, laws and social customs kept black and white communities strictly separated. Interracial adoption wasn't just socially unacceptable, it was dangerous, potentially deadly. He zoomed in further, examining every pixel. The child appeared to be a girl, approximately 7 or 8 years old. She stood slightly to the side, as if watching the photograph being taken while trying to remain unseen. One small hand was pressed against the window glass, her fingers barely visible through the curtain. This wasn't an accidental appearance. The child was deliberately positioned out of view, hidden from whoever was taking the photograph, hidden from the world. James saved multiple versions of the enhanced image at different magnification levels. He needed to show this to someone, to confirm he wasn't seeing things that weren't there. But more than that, he needed to understand what this photograph truly represented. Who was this child? Why was she hidden? And what had compelled the Johnson family to take such an extraordinary and dangerous risk? James spent the weekend unable to think about anything except the photograph. He researched Oklahoma history during the 1930s, reading accounts of life during the Great Depression, studying the social structures and racial tensions that defined the era. The more he learned, the more extraordinary the Johnson family's actions appeared. On Monday morning, he arrived at the archive before it officially opened, carrying a folder of notes and printouts. His first step was to search for any official records of the Johnson family. He logged into the National Archives database, accessing census records from 1930. The search for Johnson families in Oklahoma returned hundreds of results. James narrowed the parameters: black families, rural locations, families with children matching the approximate ages of those in the photograph. After 2 hours of careful cross-referencing, he had a list of 23 possibilities. The problem was that census records only showed names, ages, and relationships. They didn't capture the full story of people's lives, their struggles, their secrets, or their extraordinary acts of courage. The Johnson family in the photograph existed in the official record as 5 people, but James now knew that 6 people had been present in that house when the photograph was taken. He turned his attention to the photograph itself, examining it for any additional clues. The professional quality suggested it had been taken by a traveling photographer, not a casual family snapshot. During the Depression, professional photography was expensive, a luxury that struggling families rarely afforded unless there was a special reason. James contacted the Oklahoma Historical Society, composing a careful email that included the enhanced image. "I'm researching a family from your region," he wrote. "The Johnson family, photographed in the summer of 1930 in a rural area, possibly northwest of Guthrie. Any information about families by this name or about traveling photographers documenting families during this period would be greatly appreciated." While waiting for responses, he examined the physical photograph more closely under magnification. The paper quality suggested it was professionally developed. The composition was deliberate, the family positioned carefully in front of their home, the lighting even and flattering despite the harsh Oklahoma sun. His phone rang just after lunch. It was Patricia Reynolds from the Archive's genealogy department, a woman in her 70s who had been volunteering even longer than James. "I heard you're researching a Depression-era family photograph," Patricia said. "There's something you should know. In 1930, there was a documentary photography project called Faces of the Dust Bowl. Photographers traveled through Oklahoma, Kansas, and parts of Texas, documenting families affected by the drought and economic crisis. The project was privately funded and never completed, but some of the photographs survived." James felt a surge of hope. "Do you know where those photographs are now?" "The University of Oklahoma has a collection." The photographer's name was William Hutchinson. He died in 1932, but his widow donated his work to the university's archive. "If your photograph matches the style and time frame, it might be part of that collection, or at least connected to it." James immediately began drafting an email to the university. This was the break he needed, a potential connection to documentation, to names, to the story behind the image that had captivated him completely. The response from the University of Oklahoma arrived within 48 hours. Dr. Helen Martinez, the head archivist, expressed immediate interest in James's inquiry and invited him to examine the William Hutchinson collection in person. She mentioned that she'd reviewed the enhanced image he'd sent and believed it matched Hutchinson's photographic style and documentation approach. 1 week later, James found himself in Norman, Oklahoma, walking through the temperature-controlled archives at the university's library. Dr. Martinez, a woman in her early 50s with kind eyes and an evident passion for preservation, greeted him warmly and led him to a research room where she'd already prepared materials for his examination. "William Hutchinson was remarkable," she explained as she carefully placed several archival boxes on the table. "He wasn't a famous photographer, but he understood something important, that the people suffering through this depression had stories that deserved to be documented with dignity and respect." He traveled for 2 years, from 1929 until his death in 1932, photographing families throughout the region. James opened the first box with reverent care. Inside were dozens of photographs similar to the one he'd discovered. Families standing in front of homes, children in worn clothing, faces marked by hardship but radiating resilience and pride. Each image had been carefully preserved in acid-free sleeves. "Did Hutchinson keep records?" James asked, his voice tight with anticipation. "Notes about the families he photographed?" Dr. Martinez smiled and produced a leather-bound journal, its pages protected by archival gloves she handed to James. He was meticulous. Every photograph has a corresponding entry: names, dates, locations, and often personal observations or brief conversations he had with the families. James's hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages. The handwriting was small but legible, each entry dated and detailed. He searched methodically through entries from the summer of 1930, looking for any mention of the Johnson family or locations northwest of Guthrie. Then he found it, and his breath caught in his throat. Johnson family, August 12, 1930. Rural property, approximately 15 miles northwest of Guthrie, Oklahoma. Thomas Johnson, age 42, farmer. Wife, Ruth Johnson, age 37. Children, Samuel, 16, Clara, 11, Joseph, 7. Despite evident poverty and drought conditions, family maintained remarkable dignity. Mr. Johnson spoke quietly about the challenges of farming when rain refuses to fall. Mrs. Johnson mentioned that faith and family sustained them through the hardest times. They insisted on wearing their Sunday clothes for the photograph, though it was a Tuesday. Payment for the photograph, 3 dozen eggs and a jar of preserves, which I accepted gratefully. James read the entry 3 times, absorbing every detail. 5 names, 5 people documented. The photograph showed 5 people standing in front of the house, but he knew that 6 people had been present that day. The little girl in the window, the white child hidden behind the lace curtain, wasn't mentioned in Hutchinson's careful notes. She wasn't documented. She wasn't recorded. Officially, according to every record that existed, she simply wasn't there. Dr. Martinez noticed the intensity of James's expression. "Did you find what you were looking for?" James looked up from the journal, his mind already racing ahead to the next steps of his investigation. "I found what was written down," he said slowly. "But the real story is what was deliberately left out. This family was protecting someone whose very presence in their home could have gotten them killed. And they kept that secret so well that even a careful, compassionate photographer never knew she was there." Guthrie, Oklahoma, had the appearance of a town that took its history seriously. The downtown area still featured red brick buildings from the territorial era, their facades carefully maintained. Vintage street lamps lined the sidewalks, and historical markers explained the significance of various locations. This had once been the state capital, a place of importance and pride, before the government relocated to Oklahoma City in 1910. James arrived on a Tuesday morning, the late spring heat already making the air shimmer above the asphalt. He'd made an appointment with the Logan County Historical Society, which occupied a beautifully restored Victorian house on the edge of the historic district. Inside, the air was blessedly cool. The rooms were filled with carefully curated exhibits, photographs of early settlers, artifacts from the land run era, displays documenting the town's evolution through prosperity and hardship. James was greeted by Dorothy Williams, a woman in her late 70s with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that suggested she missed very little. "Dr. Martinez from the university called ahead," Dorothy said, shaking James's hand with a firm grip. "She said you're researching a local family from the Depression era. The Johnson family, she mentioned." "That's right," James confirmed, following her to a research room lined with filing cabinets and reference books. "I'm hoping you might have information about them, or at least about the area where they lived." Dorothy gestured for him to sit at a large oak table. Johnson is a common name, and there were several black families with that surname in the county during that period. Times were desperately hard for everyone, but the African-American community faced additional burdens: discrimination, limited opportunities, and the constant threat of violence. James carefully removed the enhanced photograph from his protective folder and placed it on the table. This was taken in August 1930, about 15 miles northwest of here. Dorothy put on reading glasses that hung from a chain around her neck. She studied the photograph in silence for a long moment, her expression shifting from professional interest to something deeper, recognition mixed with what appeared to be sadness. "I know this house," she said quietly, her finger hovering just above the image without touching it. "It's still standing, or what remains of it. It's been abandoned for decades, but I've seen it, and I know these people in a way, through stories my father told me." James leaned forward, hardly daring to breathe. "Your father knew the Johnson family?" "Not well. Nobody knew them well, which was unusual in itself. This was a time when communities were tight-knit by necessity. People helped each other survive. But my father mentioned the Johnsons several times over the years. He said Thomas Johnson was one of the hardest working men he'd ever met, that he could make crops grow in conditions that defeated other farmers. But there were rumors." "What kind of rumors?" Dorothy set the photograph down carefully and removed her glasses, meeting James' eyes directly. "You have to understand the time period. People survived by minding their own business, especially when it came to matters that might bring trouble. But my father told me once that the Johnsons kept to themselves more than most families did. Ruth Johnson would come to town to buy supplies, but she was always in a hurry, always anxious to get back home. She rarely brought the children with her, which people found strange. Do you know what happened to the family? Dorothy nodded slowly. Thomas died in 1945. His heart gave out after years of brutal farm work. Ruth lived longer, until about 1962, I believe. The children scattered after Thomas passed. Samuel went north to Chicago looking for factory work. Clara moved to California. I think she worked as a domestic employee for a family out there. Joseph stayed in Oklahoma the longest, but he died relatively young, sometime in the late 1980s. She paused, choosing her words carefully. But there's something else. My father told me this story shortly before he died. He said that during the worst years of the Depression, the Johnson family did something that required tremendous courage, something that could have gotten them killed if the wrong people had found out. He never told me exactly what it was, but he said it was the kind of bravery that most people never have to find in themselves, the kind that comes from choosing what's right over what's safe. James felt the weight of that statement settle over him. He pulled out the enhanced version of the photograph, the one that clearly showed the small figure in the second-floor window. Dorothy gasped softly when she saw it. Her hand rose to her mouth, and tears suddenly filled her eyes. "Dear God," she whispered. "They were hiding a child, a white child." "I believe so," James confirmed gently. "And I'm trying to find out who she was and what happened to her." Gales Changer, finding living descendants of the Johnson family required 3 weeks of intensive genealogical research. James worked methodically through census records, death certificates, marriage licenses, and every available database. Samuel's line had continued in Chicago. He had married and had 2 children before dying in 1971. Clara had remained childless during her time in California. But Joseph, the youngest child in the photograph, had married and fathered 2 daughters before his death in 1989. The younger daughter, Grace Johnson, still lived in Oklahoma City. She was 68 years old, a retired elementary school teacher who had spent her entire career working in predominantly black schools in the city's northeast side. James called the number nervously, unsure how his inquiry would be received. The phone rang 4 times before a woman answered, her voice warm but cautious. "Ms. Johnson, my name is James Brennan. I'm a historical researcher, and I've discovered something remarkable about your grandfather's family. I was hoping you might be willing to meet with me to discuss it." There was a pause. "What kind of something?" "I'd prefer to show you in person, if that's possible. I believe it's a story that your family deserves to know, a story about courage during very difficult times." Grace agreed to meet him at a coffee shop near her home in Oklahoma City. 2 days later, James sat across from her at a small table, studying a woman who carried herself with the same quiet dignity he'd seen in the faces of her grandparents in the photograph. Grace had kind eyes, silver hair cut short, and hands that showed the wear of a life spent in service to others. When James placed the original photograph on the table between them, her reaction was immediate and emotional. "Oh, my Lord," she whispered, her fingers hovering over the image without touching it. "I've never seen this picture before. That's my grandfather, Thomas. I can see the resemblance to my father, and that must be my grandmother, Ruth." Her voice caught. "These are my aunts and uncles as children. Where did you find this?" "It was part of a donated collection to the archive where I work," James explained. "But there's something more, something that wasn't visible until we used modern technology to examine the photograph more closely." He placed the enhanced version beside the original. "Look at the second-floor window." Grace picked up the enhanced image, bringing it closer to her face. Her eyes widened, and she sat back in her chair as if physically pushed. "There's someone there. A child? But she's white? How is that possible?" "That's exactly what I've been trying to understand," James said gently. "According to every official record, census data, photographer's notes, everything, your grandparents had 3 children. But this photograph proves that at least 6 people were present in that house in August 1930. Grace set the photograph down with trembling hands. "My father rarely talked about his childhood. He said those were hard times and some memories were too painful to revisit. But there was one thing he mentioned, just once, when I was in my 20s. She paused, gathering her thoughts. "We were talking about courage, about what it really meant to be brave. And he said that his parents had done something during the Depression that required absolute secrecy, something that could have destroyed the family if anyone had discovered it. He said they protected someone when it was dangerous to do so, when the right thing to do was also the most terrifying thing they could imagine." "Did he ever say who they protected?" Grace shook her head. "He died before I was old enough to ask the right questions, before I understood how important those stories were. But after he passed, when we were going through his belongings, I found something strange in a small wooden box he'd kept in his bedroom." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small velvet pouch. From it, she removed a delicate silver bracelet, tarnished with age but still beautiful. "It's a child's bracelet. I had it examined once. It's real silver, probably from the 1920s. There's an engraving on the inside." James took the bracelet carefully, turning it to catch the light. In tiny, elegant script, he could make out the words, Emily, 1923. His heart began to race. Emily, if this date indicates when she was born, she would have been 7 years old in 1930. Grace nodded, tears forming in her eyes. My father kept this his entire life. It was important enough to preserve, to protect, but he never told anyone why. Now I think I'm beginning to understand. The silver bracelet, became the key that unlocked the next phase of James's investigation. With a name, Emily, and an approximate birth year of 1923, he returned to the archives with renewed purpose and focus. The child in the window was no longer just a mysterious figure. She was becoming a real person with an identity. James began searching through birth records for Logan County and the surrounding areas, looking for any child named Emily born in or around 1923. The search was complicated by the fact that birth registration wasn't always consistent in rural Oklahoma during that period, and many families, particularly poor ones, never formally registered births with the county. After 2 days of searching, he found something that made his pulse quicken. In the Guthrie newspaper archives, dated March 15, 1930, there was a small obituary notice tucked away on page 6. Tragedy strikes local family. Millers lost to influenza. The brief article described the deaths of Robert and Catherine Miller, a white farming couple who lived on a small property outside Guthrie, and their 6-year-old son, David. The entire family had succumbed to influenza within a single week during the brutal winter of 1930. The disease had swept through the region, claiming lives indiscriminately, hitting hardest in areas where poverty and malnutrition had already weakened people's resistance. But what caught James' attention was the final sentence. The deceased are survived by a daughter, Emily Miller, age 7, whose placement is pending with Logan County authorities. James read the article 3 times, his hands shaking slightly. Emily Miller, age 7 in March 1930, which would make her birth year 1923, exactly matching the date on the bracelet. The timeline aligned perfectly. He immediately began searching for follow-up records. There should have been documentation, county placement records, orphanage admission papers, foster care files, or adoption proceedings. But as he searched through every available database and archive, he found nothing. Emily Miller had simply disappeared from all official records after March 1930. It was as if the child had vanished into thin air. James cross-referenced the dates carefully. The Miller family died in early March 1930. The Johnson family photograph was taken in August of the same year, 5 months later. 5 months during which Emily Miller existed in no official capacity, appeared in no government records, and left no documented trace of her existence. He expanded his search to the Miller family's estate records. The farm had been small and heavily mortgaged. After the deaths, the property was sold at auction to pay off debts. The auction records listed various items sold: farming equipment, livestock, household furniture, and personal belongings. And there, buried in the itemized list of buyers, James found what he was looking for. Ruth Johnson had purchased items at the Miller estate auction on March 28, 1930. The specific items she bought sent chills down his spine. One child's rocking chair, a box of children's books, and a small trunk described as girls' clothing and personal items. Why would a struggling family during the Great Depression, a family barely able to feed their own 3 children, spend precious money on furniture and belongings for a child who didn't officially exist in their household? The answer was becoming heartbreakingly clear. Thomas and Ruth Johnson had taken Emily Miller in after her family's death, hiding her from the county authorities and from their community, protecting her in an act of extraordinary compassion that carried tremendous risk. James sat back in his chair, overwhelmed by the implications. In 1930s Oklahoma, a black family harboring a white child could face accusations of kidnapping. They could be arrested, lynched, or driven from their home by vigilante mobs. The racial boundaries of the era were enforced with brutal violence. And crossing those boundaries, especially in a way that involved a white child, was one of the most dangerous things they could possibly do. Yet Thomas and Ruth Johnson had done it anyway. They had looked at a 7-year-old orphan facing an uncertain fate in an overcrowded, underfunded county orphanage system, and they had chosen love over safety, compassion over fear. James arranged to meet with Grace Johnson again, this time at her home in Oklahoma City. He brought copies of everything he'd discovered: the newspaper obituary, the estate auction records, Ruth Johnson's purchases, and enlarged versions of the photograph showing Emily in the window. Grace's home was modest, but warmly decorated, filled with family photographs spanning multiple generations. She welcomed James into her living room, where afternoon sunlight streamed through lace curtains remarkably similar to those visible in the 1930 photograph of her grandparents' house. They sat together at her dining table, and James carefully laid out each piece of evidence, explaining the timeline and connections he'd discovered. Grace listened in silence, her hands folded in her lap, tears occasionally streaming down her face as the full story of her grandparents' courage emerged. They didn't just take in a child who needed help, James explained gently. They risked everything: their lives, their children's lives, their home, everything they had. In 1930s Oklahoma, what they did could have resulted in lynching. The fact that they kept Emily hidden so carefully suggests they understood the danger perfectly. Grace wiped her eyes with a tissue. Why would they take such a terrible risk? They had 3 children of their own to protect. James had spent considerable time thinking about this question. Based on everything I've learned about your grandparents, I believe they saw a child who would otherwise be lost in a system that was already overwhelmed and underfunded. County orphanages in rural Oklahoma during the Depression were overcrowded, underfunded, and often brutal places. Children died there from disease, neglect, and abuse. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Your grandmother purchased a rocking chair and children's books at the Miller Estate auction. That wasn't impulsive, it was preparation. She was getting ready to care for Emily, to give her a home. This was a deliberate choice, made with full knowledge of the risks. How long did Emily stay with them? Grace asked quietly. This was the question James couldn't yet fully answer. Emily's trail went cold after 1930. There were no school records, no medical records, no documentation of any kind that would indicate what happened to her or how long she remained with the Johnson family. Grace stood and walked to a bookshelf, returning with a worn leather Bible, its cover cracked with age. This belonged to my grandmother Ruth. My father gave it to me before he died. She used it to record important family events, births, deaths, marriages. Everything significant got written down in the front pages. She opened the Bible carefully to the family registry section. There, in faded brown ink, were the entries James expected to see. Thomas and Ruth's marriage on June 14, 1913. Samuel's birth on April 3, 1914. Clara's birth on September 22, 1919. Joseph's birth on January 8, 1923. But at the bottom of the page, in slightly different handwriting, as if added later, was one more entry that made James's breath catch. Emily Rose Miller entered our care March 18, 1930. Left for safety, December 7, 1933. James photographed the page carefully with his phone, capturing every detail. She was with them for 3 years and 8 months. Long enough to be family, long enough to love and be loved. Grace touched the Bible page with trembling fingers. My grandmother kept this secret even in her most private records. She wrote it down, but told no one. That takes a special kind of love. The kind that doesn't need recognition or praise. The kind that exists purely because it's right. The specific date in December 1933 is significant, James noted. Something happened that month that made your grandparents decide Emily needed to leave. Some threat or danger that made staying too risky. I need to find out what that was and where she went. Grace closed the Bible gently, holding it against her chest. My grandmother kept her safe for almost 4 years, hidden from the world, loved in secret. And then she let her go because keeping her would have meant putting her in danger. That's not just courage, that's the deepest kind of love there is. James's search for Emily's fate after December 1933 led him down unexpected paths. He researched orphanages and children's homes throughout Oklahoma, but found no records of Emily Miller's admission or placement. He searched for adoption records, but the files from that era were either incomplete or had been destroyed decades earlier. Then, following a hunch, he began exploring connections between Oklahoma's and other states, where families fleeing difficult circumstances during the Depression might have relocated. Many African-American families moved north to cities like Chicago, Detroit, and Cleveland, seeking better opportunities and escape from Southern segregation. Religious organizations often facilitated these migrations, helping families establish new lives in northern cities. James contacted Catholic charities throughout the Midwest, explaining his research and asking about records from 1933 and 1934. Most responses were discouraging. Records from that era were incomplete. Files had been lost to fires or floods. Privacy laws prevented disclosure. But then came a response from the Archdiocese of Chicago that changed everything. The archivist, Father Thomas O'Malley, wrote that he'd found a reference to an Emily Miller in their records from December 1933. A letter existed in their permanent files, written by Father Michael O'Brien to the Diocese of Oklahoma City, acknowledging receipt of a child who had been sent north by a family unable to provide for her continued safety in their community due to circumstances beyond their control. James immediately called Father O'Malley, barely able to contain his excitement. Is there any more information? Any details about where she came from or who sent her? The letter is quite detailed, actually, Father O'Malley replied. It describes Emily as being in good health, remarkably well educated for her circumstances, and emotionally mature beyond her years. Father O'Brien noted that she carried with her a letter from her previous guardians, sealed and marked to be given to Emily when she reached adulthood, specifically on her 18th birthday. James's heart pounded. Does that letter still exist? I searched our archives thoroughly. The envelope was opened in 1941 when Emily turned 18. She came to the church to claim it. I found both the envelope and the letter itself, still preserved in our files. Would it be possible for me to see it? There was a pause. This is highly unusual, but given the historical significance and the fact that all parties involved have long since passed away, I believe an exception can be made. Can you come to Chicago? 3 days later, James sat in the archives room of the Catholic Cathedral in Chicago, wearing white cotton gloves, as Father O'Malley placed a yellowed envelope in front of him. The envelope was marked in careful handwriting, "For Emily Rose Miller, to be opened on her 18th birthday, March 15th, 1941. With reverent care, James removed the letter inside. The paper was thin, the ink faded, but still legible. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, written by someone who took great care with words. "Dearest Emily, by the time you read this, you will be a young woman, and we will be nothing but memories, if that. We pray that you have been safe, healthy, and loved during these years apart. We want you to know that caring for you was never a burden. You were never unwanted. You brought light and joy into our home during the darkest times any of us had ever known. We did not send you away because we stopped loving you. We sent you away because we loved you too much to see you harmed. The danger grew too great. People began to notice things, a face in the window, supplies purchased that didn't match our family size. We heard threats spoken in town, saw suspicion in neighbors' eyes. We knew it was only a matter of time before someone came to investigate. Your safety mattered more than our hearts. It was the hardest decision we ever made, but it was also the clearest. You deserved a chance at life, at education, at a future free from fear. We hope you will remember us kindly. We hope you will know that families are built not just by blood, but by choice, by sacrifice, and by love. You were our daughter in every way that mattered, even if the world could never know it. Live well, Emily. Live freely. Live with joy. And know that somewhere, in a small house in Oklahoma, there were people who loved you enough to let you go. Forever in our prayers, Thomas and Ruth Johnson." James sat in the quiet archive room, tears streaming down his face as he read the letter twice more. This was the final piece. The proof of a love that had transcended every barrier society had constructed, every law designed to keep people separated, every threat meant to enforce racial boundaries. Thomas and Ruth Johnson had looked at an orphaned white child and seen simply a child who needed love. They had risked everything to provide that love, and when keeping her became too dangerous, they had made the ultimate sacrifice. They had let her go to keep her safe. Father O'Malley sat quietly across the table. "It's a remarkable document," he said softly, "a testament to the best of human nature during one of the worst periods in our history." James carefully photographed every word of the letter. "What happened to Emily after 1941? Do you have any records?" "There's a notation in our files that she married in 1945 to a man named Robert Sullivan. She took his name and moved to a suburb north of Chicago. Beyond that, I don't have information, but if she's still alive, she would be," he calculated quickly, "approximately 101 years old." It was a long shot, but James had come this far. He had to try to find her, to complete the circle, to bring this hidden story finally into the light. Finding Emily took 2 more weeks of intensive searching. James worked with genealogists and public records specialists, tracking marriage licenses, property records, and obituaries. Emily Miller had become Emily Sullivan in 1945. She had 3 children, all of whom were still living. And remarkably, impossibly, Emily herself was still alive at 101 years old, living in an assisted care facility in Evanston, Illinois. James contacted her daughter, Catherine, explaining his research carefully. Catherine was skeptical at first. Her mother rarely spoke about her early childhood, and the story James described seemed almost impossible to believe. But when James sent her the enhanced photograph and copies of the letter from Thomas and Ruth, Catherine called him back within an hour, her voice thick with emotion. "My mother needs to see this," she said. "She needs to know that someone finally discovered the truth." James arranged a visit, and he invited Grace Johnson to join him. The 2 of them, descendants of the family who had hidden the child and the child herself, would meet for the first time, bringing together a story that had remained separated for 94 years. On a bright May morning, James and Grace arrived at the assisted living facility. Catherine met them in the lobby, a woman in her 70s with her mother's gentle eyes. She led them to a sunny common room where Emily sat in a comfortable chair by the window, wrapped in a soft blanket despite the warm weather. Emily's face was deeply lined, her hair completely white, but her eyes were sharp and aware. When Catherine placed the enlarged photograph in her mother's hands, Emily's reaction was immediate and profound. Her hands began to shake, and tears spilled down her weathered cheeks. "That's them," she whispered, her voice fragile but clear. "That's the family who saved my life. I never thought I'd see their faces again." Grace moved closer, kneeling beside Emily's chair. "Mrs. Sullivan, my name is Grace Johnson. Thomas and Ruth were my grandparents. The children in that photograph, Samuel, Clara, and Joseph, were my father and my aunts." Emily reached out with trembling fingers and touched Grace's face, tears flowing freely now. "You have Ruth's eyes." "Oh, you have her eyes. She was the kindest person I ever knew." "Aw." For the next 2 hours, Emily told her story. She remembered the Johnsons with profound love and gratitude, Ruth teaching her to read by lamplight in the upstairs room, Thomas lifting her onto his shoulders when no one else could see, the children treating her like a sister despite the secrecy required. She described living in that room, watching the world through the window but unable to be part of it, understanding even at 7 years old that her presence endangered everyone she loved. I tried to be quiet, Emily said, her voice breaking. I tried to be invisible. I understood that I couldn't go outside, couldn't be seen, but they made me feel loved anyway. Ruth would sit with me every night and tell me stories. Thomas would bring me wildflowers he'd picked in the fields. The children would play quiet games with me upstairs, teaching me songs they'd learned at school. Why did they send you away? Grace asked gently, holding Emily's hand. Emily's expression darkened with old memories. Someone saw me through the window. A neighbor had come by unexpectedly, and I was standing too close to the glass. I don't think they saw me clearly, but it was enough to raise questions. Thomas heard men talking in town, saying strange things were happening at the Johnson place, that maybe the county should investigate. She paused, gathering strength. That night, Thomas and Ruth sat me down and explained that I had to leave. They said it wasn't because they didn't love me, but because they loved me too much to let me be taken away, or to let anything happen to me, or to them. They put me on a train north with a Catholic priest who was traveling to Chicago. Ruth gave me the bracelet that had belonged to my mother and a letter she said I could read when I was grown. Emily looked at James, who had been documenting everything quietly. I read that letter on my 18th birthday, and I've read it hundreds of times since. It was the most precious thing I owned. It told me I was loved. It told me I mattered. It told me that what we'd had together was real, even if the world never acknowledged it. James produced the original letter from his folder. The church in Chicago preserved it. It's been waiting for this moment, for this reunion, for over 80 years. Grace took out her grandmother's Bible, showing Emily the entry about her placement and departure. Emily touched the page with reverence, reading Ruth's handwriting, seeing her name written in the family record. I was family, Emily whispered. They wrote me down. I was really family. The three of them sat together in the sunny room, James, Grace, and Emily, as the old woman shared memories that had been locked inside her for nearly a century. She described Ruth's gentle voice singing hymns while cooking, Thomas's calloused hands that were always gentle with children, the sound of laughter that sometimes filled the house despite the hardship surrounding them. After I left, I built a life, Emily said. I married, had children, worked as a teacher. I had a good life, but I never forgot them. I tried to find them after I grew up, but I only had first names and fragments of memories. I didn't know their last name. They'd been careful never to let me know details that could identify them if I were ever questioned. I thought I'd never know what happened to them, never be able to thank them. Grace pulled out more photographs, images of Thomas in his later years, of Ruth tending a small garden, of the children as adults. Emily held each one, studying faces she had loved and lost, reconnecting across the decades with the family who had risked everything for her. They were heroes, Emily said finally, her voice strong despite her tears. Not the kind who get monuments or parades, the kind who simply did what was right when it was dangerous to do so. They saw a child who needed love, and they gave it, even though it could have cost them everything. James had spent months researching, investigating, and piecing together this story. Now, sitting in this room with these two women whose lives had been shaped by one family's extraordinary courage, he understood the full weight of what he had uncovered. The photograph taken in August 1930 had captured more than just an image. It had preserved evidence of a love that defied every law and custom of its time. It had documented a moment when humanity triumphed over hatred, when compassion overcame fear, when a family chose what was right instead of what was safe. Nearly a century after it was taken, the photograph had finally revealed its complete truth. That hidden in plain sight was a story of extraordinary courage, sacrifice, and love that had changed two families forever, and proved that the bonds of family were stronger than any barrier humans could construct to keep people apart. Emily looked at Grace, and Grace looked back, and in that exchange, something broken was finally made whole. The secret kept for 94 years was finally known, the love hidden for so long was finally acknowledged, and the truth that had waited patiently in a photograph was finally given voice.